All right, so we're going to quickly review matter. We've been talking about living matter, but I think you need to review exactly what is matter as far as the definition of matter. And most students kind of have this one memorized, but they don't really think about what it means. So on page 106, it says anything that has mass and takes up space is called matter. So matter is made up of basic units called atoms, and the definition of an atom is the smallest unit of substance that maintains the properties of that substance. So that's very similar to our definition of a cell, right? The basic unit of life or the basic unit of living matter. Atoms are what make up cells. So it's important that you understand that cells are larger than atoms because cells are made up of atoms. So we're going to write cells are made of atoms. So if I were to ask you, which is smaller, a cell or an atom? Well, an atom is smaller. Atoms make up the matter in you, around you, everything that you touch, taste, feel, smell, such as clothing, food, flowers. All of that's made of atoms. What is not matter are things that don't have mass or don't take up space. So energy, such as sunlight, heat, sound energy. Energy is not matter. Your thoughts, your dreams, those don't have mass and don't take up space. So those are not matter. So when we talk about atoms, we remember the periodic table that you learned about in 6th grade, and you talked about things called elements and molecules. So your question says, as you read, underline the properties that distinguish elements from molecules. Now, you'll notice that underlining a lot of times is what they ask you to do in the question. If you underline instead of highlight as you read, then you have no idea where your answer is when you go to find it. So if I gave a quiz and I said, you have 3 minutes, write down whatever you underlined for question number 5 on page 106. If you just underlined everything, you're going to have a hard time doing that quiz. So I recommend as you read, highlight, and then questions that ask you to underline things, you underline. An element is a substance that is made up of the whole thing is made up of just one type of atom. For example, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen. Those are all elements that you can find on the periodic table. They are very common on the Earth, but when atoms of one or more elements are joined together, that's when we call it a molecule. So a molecule is a group of atoms held together by attractive forces. We call those forces chemical bonds. If a molecule contains at least 2 different elements, it can also be called a compound molecule. So for example, water. Water is a compound because it has one oxygen bonded to 2 hydrogens. And so that makes it a compound molecule, just like a compound word like raincoat. It's 2 words, they're different, you put them together. Characteristics of a substance, such as water, are caused by the properties and the interactions of the atoms and the molecules that make up that substance. So let's go back to question number 5. It says, underline the properties that distinguish elements from molecules. If something is distinguished, it's different from the rest. So they want to know what is different from an element to a molecule. Well, the element is made of one type of atom, and a molecule is a group of atoms. And if it's a compound, those are at least 2 different elements. So that would be our answer to number 5. So we answered it. We can check the box. On to page 107. A lot of times when you're reading, we'll have these think outside the book, and they're great activities, but they take a lot of time that we don't usually get to, so we're not doing number 6. What are cells? This is review of what we learned last unit. It says when viewed under a microscope, living matter appears to be made of tiny structures, while non-living matter is not. In 1665, an English scientist named Robert Hooke was the first person to describe the tiny box-like structures that he saw in a thin slice of tree bark, also known as cork. He named them cells, which comes from the Latin word for small room. A cell is the smallest functional and structural unit of all living things. Further research confirmed that all living things are made of cells, and we know that that is part of cell theory, one of the 3 parts. Even tinier structures exist within cells, and they're called organelles. These organelles have special functions that keep the cell working properly. There's an organelle that breaks down food molecules to release the energy. There's other molecules, other organelles that move molecules around the cell. But all living things are made up of cells. So if we have a unicellular organism, that means it is made of just one cell. They can live independently of one another because they can carry out all of life's functions. However, if it's multicellular, that means it's made of many cells, and they cannot live independently because they depend on each other to maintain the life functions of that organism. Such multicellular organisms include the pronghorn antelope here, made of many different cell types, including muscle cells, skin cells, blood cells, nerve cells. Grass is also made up of different types of cells. We say these are specialized. Each cell has a specific function in a multicellular organism, and many of the organelles that are in these cells are similar and have similar functions. So when it says identify the living and non-living matter in this picture, rather than living, we're going to use biotic because we know that's what that means. And instead of non-living, we're going to write abiotic. And then in how can scientists determine what is living matter? So your answer is going to start off with biotic factors are. So biotic factors are, I don't want the definition, I want you to look in the picture and find some living things. So you might list the pronghorn, you might list what the pronghorn's eating, grass or shrubs. Okay, so I'm going to leave a line so that you can fill that in. And then we're going to write abiotic factors are, and then looking in the picture, you see some rocks, you see some soil. We know that it's breathing air, so you could put air. And then how do scientists determine what is living matter? Well, all living matter is made of cells. So you would write in made of cells. All right, on page 108, what are the 2 types of cells that make up organisms? Those are either the ones with a nucleus, which are eukaryotic. It tells us that the nucleus is an organelle. It stores the cell's genetic material and controls cell growth and reproduction. You are made of eukaryotic cells. Cells that do not have a nucleus are called prokaryotic. Bacteria is an example of a prokaryotic cell. Organisms can be made up of either prokaryotic or eukaryotic, but you can't be both. So question 8 says, as you read, underline the characteristics of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So I'm going to read about prokaryotic cells and then eukaryotic cells. It says prokaryotic cells are usually much smaller than eukaryotic cells. Their typical size range, you don't have to remember that. Prokaryotic cells have a cell membrane, but do not have organelles that are enclosed in a separate membrane. Their genetic material forms a loop within the cell. The genetic material and their organelles are suspended in a liquid interior of the cell, and all prokaryotic cells are unicellular. Bacteria and archaea are examples. So if I were to list characteristics of prokaryotes, that would be they're smaller, they have a cell membrane, they have genetic material. We know that genetic material is called DNA. They have a liquid interior, we'll learn it's called cytoplasm, and they're unicellular. Eukaryotic cells, of course, are larger than the prokaryotes. They have a nucleus that holds their genetic material. They also have organelles that are surrounded by a membrane. Some are unicellular, and those examples are like yeast and amoeba. However, most of them are multicellular, such as animals, plants, fungi. They left one out. You can add it in, protist or protista. So we're going to add that in and highlight that. Here are some pictures of what they would look like under a microscope. Those are muscle cells that would be in this human. Here are some plant cells that would be in the leaf of that plant, and then some bacteria that might be in the soil. It says, where else might you find prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells in this photograph? So look for those and write your answer. All right, in your journal on page 10 at the top, you're going to write the title, Prokaryotes and Eukaryotes. And we're going to take those textbook pages that we just annotated, and we're going to cut some of that page off. So make sure you just have one page here. And between eukaryotic, the red, and this, we're just going to cut straight across the top so that it looks like that. You can go ahead and close your textbook pages. Now I'm going to cut up the side, so I'm going to be really cutting just that much off the edge. I'm also going to turn it at the bottom, see where the page number is. I'm going to cut in between the page number and the bottom of that box that says visualize it. And this should be enough for this to fit nicely in my journal, but I'm going to pre-fit it, so I'm going to feel and see, does it stick out over the edge? If it does, this will get torn, and that looks terrible, and we don't want that. So I'm going to check it. It does fit, so I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to put glue on the outside perimeter. It doesn't take a lot. If glue is oozing out, you're using too much glue. And then I'm going to flip it over and make sure it fits on that side and smooth it in. Again, that's page 10 in your journal.